Appreciate. Thank you so much, Dr. Okello, for the invitation to join the great and brilliant work that you are doing at Penn State University. Thank you to the Center for the Study of Higher Education, as well as the College of Education at Penn State University, for making space for this conversation to flourish and to move forward. I want to thank all of the attendees for carving time out of your day to engage in this conversation here today. There's so much going on in the world around us, including a shutdown of our government, but we still found time to be in community on today. So I just want to name and call that out because that is important. That is a source of being and healing for Black communities and for Black people. So I do want to thank you all for making space to be in community today. I titled this talk Mapping Otherwise Elsewhere, Black Geographies and the Study of Education. And when I received the invitation to join the community today, it took me a while to figure out how I wanted to structure our time because this invitation felt not like a moment to rehash research that I have already done. It didn't feel like um, a moment to just sort of demonstrate or show you what you can find through a Google search, through a Google search or a Google Scholar search. Instead, this moment felt like an opportunity to meditate on some new ideas, to think differently and critically, and about work that I have already done and then also work that I plan to do in the future. So, if you will indulge me just a little bit, I want to use this moment to consider some other ideas and some directions that I might be going into, as well as identify and hopefully gather some other scholars and emerging scholars who are thinking at the intersections of race, space, and policy as we might begin to continue to form and forge new ideas around what it means to take up Black geographies, specifically in the study of education. And that was what led me to the title of this talk, Mapping Otherwise Elsewhere, Black Geography and the Study of Education. Just by a quick way of introduction, I want to just sort of lay out a foundation for our time together, mapping the door, borrowing from Dion Brand. I want to start today with just a little bit about my background, my intellectual journey, and my positionality. From there, I'll move to thinking about an overview of my program of research. I think it's important to sort of anchor my current thinking in sort of my broader program of scholarship so you get a sense of who I am and the ideas that are of particular interest to me and my scholarship. Given that Dr. Okello gave me the large charge of kicking off this webinar series, I wanted to satisfy the room with a primer on Black geographies, just because I think it would help to anchor our thinking and understanding as we enter the conversation of Black geographies here and going forward. And then I'll play a little bit with this concept of locating the inner eye, leave us with a bit around a Black optic before we end our talk today with some enduring questions and queries that folk might consider in their own scholarship. So just to say a little bit about who I am, or more specifically, how I came to this work that I'm engaged in. As a student at the University of Michigan, I majored in Black Studies and Literature. That becomes important throughout this talk because I do not miss an opportunity to bring literature and Black studies and all these ideas back into my current research. So I'm always thinking with fiction and other literature because I think that is a source of world making in and of itself and understanding. So I continue to bring that work and those ideas into the work that I do today. After spending time at Michigan and working specifically in a high security men's correctional facility and juvenile detention center, I left that space to become a high school teacher, and I've taught in predominantly all Black schools in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Atlanta, and New York City. Sort of had a chance to work specifically and directly with Black communities and Black youth across a number of different domains. So I had a chance to do that and then move from that space to do some work around policy at different levels of policy scale. Primarily, my work within policy space was at the intersection of health and wellness. So I thought a lot about anti-bullying and suicide ideation, but also how to reform schools for historically marginalized communities to thrive, to be in school. So, did a lot of work around school reform. And I bring all of those ideas and those experiences to the work I do currently as a researcher and professor at the University of Pennsylvania, where my I just got another secondary appointment in the School of Education. So honored to, although I'm currently in the School of Social Policy and Practice, and I love the interdisciplinarity of my unit. I always love being around my educators and those who are interested in transforming the lives of young people through these institutions of schools. Those experiences and those ideas are what anchor my scholarly research agenda. I won't spend a lot of time going through this, but I think about my research agenda in terms of puzzle pieces and not in terms of strands, because strands feel disjointed and not intersecting. So I think about sort of these pieces of a puzzle that form a masterpiece, interests around police and criminal justice, education policy and politics, race and racism, specifically anti-Blackness, education policy and school reform. I am not only concerned with the material and the everyday, but also the abstract and the conceptual. So again, those are ideas that you will see interwoven throughout our time we'll spend today. I want to jump into the talk. So let's go to excuse me, on Black geographies. I first encountered Black geographies during my doctoral program at UCLA. At that time, I was interested in the intersection of race, space, and policy, but I wasn't quite sure how those things came together in a specific and meaningful way. Having majored in Black studies and literature as an undergrad, I knew I wanted to think about how my interdisciplinary training could inform my new wonderings about the world. Whenever I would tell my professors and classmates in the School of Education that I wanted to explore how race, space, and policy intersected, the response I got was usually the same. Oh, you want to study gentrification? But I wasn't quite interested in gentrification. I mean, sure, I was curious about how policy enabled Black bodies to be displaced, dispossessed, and dispersed across landscapes, but that wasn't the crux of what I wanted to explore. And not yet having the language to articulate the intricacies of what I wanted to research, I struggled to communicate what about race and space and policy was compelling and how those dynamics were lived and impressed on Black communities. During my final semester of coursework, I took a course with Dr. Edward Soja, the postmodern political geographer and urban theorist, who was largely interested in the relationship between the social and the spatial. What he coined as the socio-spatial dialectic, a concept that describes the mutually constitutive relationship between society and space. The core idea of the socio-spatial dialectic is that the way that we organize, design, and structure space is shaped by social relations like power, race, class, capital, and culture, and that those spaces shape society. That is, once produced, spatial arrangements feed back into social life, reinforcing inequalities, structuring opportunities, and influencing how people live, how people work, how people relate to one another. So basically, it's the idea that the spatiality of social life is both an outcome and a medium, a presupposition and a result of social interaction. And this was, for me, the first time that I started to think about how our behaviors and our beings could be spatial products and at the same time producers of space. When I met with Dr. Soldier and asked him to be on my dissertation committee and discuss my emerging research interests in relation to his conceptualization of the socio-spatial dialectic, he suggested that I read Development Arrested, The Blues and Plantation Power in the Mississippi Delta, written by Clyde Woods. During the same meeting, after he agreed to serve on my committee, he told me my research reminded him of early conversations he had with Clyde as he was forming his dissertation project. Edward Soldier also told me that he was Clyde's dissertation chair and that the book that he had just recommended that I read was Clyde's dissertation research that had been later transformed into a book. So it was very early on that in my doctoral training that I'm being introduced to these ideas outside of the School of Education across campus in the Department of Urban Planning in the Luskin School of Social Welfare. Development Arrested, when I read the book, was probably the first time that I had encountered a text that was primarily rooted in spatial orientation and race and policy, all the hallmarks of what I wanted to do. And it wasn't about gentrification. I felt like I had finally found my tribe, y'all. Like digging deeper into Clyde's work, I unearthed his volume with Catherine McKittrick, Black Geographies and the Politics of Place. Together, these texts fundamentally reshaped my thinking and introduced me to the burgeoning subfield of Black geographies. The way I understand Black geographies is as a corrective. I see Black geographies and I understand it as a scholarly intervention to how geographers treated race and racism, but specifically how they treated Blackness. Since the history of the field of geography, much like so many other fields, has primarily overlooked questions of race, turning instead to questions of capital, Black geographies serves to illuminate Black spatial knowledge, negotiations, and resistances on the one hand, and geographies of domination, such as colonial slavery, imperial, racial, sexual displacement on the other hand. Black geographies largely argues that space is not neutral, but that it is racialized and constantly shaped and reshaped by histories of slavery, segregation, colonialism, and ongoing anti-Blackness. At the same time, Black geographies recognizes that Black people have always created alternative geographies through modes of resistance, fugitivity, community building, and world making. Such practices disrupt dominant spatial orders. In this way, you can see Black geographies as both critical by exposing how cartographic imaginations of space have been used to control, constrain, and oppress Black life. But Black geographies is also generative as it illuminates how Black life itself produces alternate ways of imagining and inhabiting space. In the text I showed on the previous slide, the volume by Catherine McKittrick and Clyde Woods, um, they identify three central themes that inform the study of Black geographies. One is this concept of the elsewheres. Black geographies examines the ways in which essentialism situates Black subjects and their geopolitical concerns as being elsewhere, on the margins, the underside, outside of what's considered normal. A spatial practice that conveniently props up the mythical norm and erases or obscures the daily struggles of particular communities. The second thing that Black geography sets out to do is examine how the lives of Black subjects demonstrate the common sense working of modernity and citizenship, and how those things are worked out and normalized through geographies of exclusions, which should resonate around what I mentioned earlier in Soja's notion of the socio-spatial dialectic. It takes us back to how geography and space are mutually constitutive of each other. And then third, uh, one of the things that Black geography sets out to do is to examine the situated knowledges of Black communities and how they contribute to both real and imagined urban geographies as significant political acts of expression. These are sort of anchors or tenets, if you will, of how Black geography sort of serves to be a corrective to the broader field of geography. In my work, specifically, I consider that Black geographies begins with a simple but unsettling truth, that space is never neutral, nor is she innocent. It has always been racialized, mapped, and measured against Black life. From the auction block to the ghetto, from the plantation field to the prison cell, from the ground that we walk on and the borders that we cross, the neighborhoods that we inhabit, and all of those spaces are shaped by long histories of segregation and anti-Blackness. Black geographies understands that spaces have always been weaponized. And by weaponized, I mean mapped, bounded, and ordered to contain and control Black life, to surveil it, to regulate it, and ultimately to erase it. Black geographies insists and makes room for a second truth that's more life-giving. Black life has always remade space. From the hush harbor hidden in the woods where enslaved Africans would gather to practice religious beliefs and cultural traditions and community bonds, to the Underground Railroad stitched across hostile spatial terrains, from the rent parties and juke joints that turned tenement walls into sites of joy and survival, like we witnessed in the movie Sinners. and the block party that transformed the streets into living commons, Black geographies have always exceeded the maps drawn and animated by the physical eye of power and domination. What I offer here is I try to particularly think about what are some of the core or key offerings or essential offerings that Black geographies can provide us in education to really think about Black geography specifically within the domain of education. And I've sort of narrowed that down or tried to synthesize it into these four essential offerings. One is that Black geography teaches us that Black matters are spatial matters, that the story of Black life, Black living, and Black aliveness is always a story of place. It is simultaneously a story of forced displacement, but also a story of grounded presence. The sites I mentioned earlier, that is the plantation and the ghetto and the prison, are not mere backdrops or containers where life is lived, yet they are active instruments in the making of race and capital. This was the point that soldiers' work inspired in my thinking. The second essential offering that I think Black geography makes room for us in education is that Black geography teaches us that space is produced and it is productive. That geography does not simply reflect society, it also organizes and arranges it. In this way, Black geography sees something like redlining not just as a line on a map to render neighborhood spaces as ineligible for Black home ownership, but Black geographies would see that red line as a wound that continues to structure schools, wealth, and health, and the black residents who live within those spaces. The prison is not just a building or a structure of containment, but it is an architect of social and physical death. So here I'm thinking a lot with Orlando Patterson's work specifically. And then the third offering I think Black Geographies provides for us is that it teaches us that to live a Black life is to always fundamentally produce geographic knowledge. The everyday praxis of survival and survivorship, of refusal and of care, are forms of spatial intelligence that document and demonstrate ways of knowing and remaking the world. Black spatial intelligence, or what I have previously discussed as Black spatial imaginaries, understands the ways that Black residents and neighborhoods might gather on a stoop, a tradition in Harlem and Brooklyn that we bear witness to and Spike Lee highlighted in his 1990s film Crooklyn. So shout out to Crooklyn, one of my favorite films. Or we can also think about sort of how Black life produces geographic knowledge and the way that music remakes the streets. Like we can witness currently in the grassroots movements that are currently happening in Washington, D.C., on the corner of 7th and U Street in the Shaw Howard neighborhood, where local residents have launched a resistance campaign to refuse the displacement of Black communities. And as part of that campaign, they play go-go music right on the street as loud as possible as a sign of protest to bring awareness to efforts that attempt to dislodge Black Washingtonians from the city and further transform DC from Chocolate City to Cappuccino City. We also see that Black production of Black geographic knowledge in the ways that kinship ties stretch across borders and enclosures to make place for Black life to thrive. And then the last essential offering I want to highlight is that Black geographies teaches us that imagination in and of itself is a spatial praxis. To dream otherwise and to dream of otherwise worlds is already to map new terrains and new landscapes. Black geographies insists that fugitivity, refusal, and joy are not only responses to anti-Blackness, but they are practices of building different geographies to build new worlds that exist that exist right at the intersections of the dominant world order or in response to that. And then a few more things I want to say, just as we sort of consider what Black geographies offers us and provides for us in education, is I think Black geographies holds two aims at the core of its project. One of those aims is to critique, and the other one of those aims is to create. Black Geographies seeks to expose how space has been mobilized to enforce racial capitalism. This observation most prominently noted by abolitionist geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore in her book Golden Gulag, Prisons, Surplus, crises, and opposition in globalizing California. In this text, she lays bare how prisons have been deployed as technologies of Black unfreedom. Her analysis can be extended to physical maps, borders, schools, and even housing projects, all of which continue to be sites of unfreedom. Black Geographies refuses the fiction of neutrality in geography and instead teaches us how anti Blackness is built into the very arrangements of land, city, and nation. Black Geographies, though, also seeks to create, to bring into view the alternative geographies Black people have already made and continue to remake daily, to illuminate how everyday Blackness, the ordinariness of Blackness, offers blueprints, or should I say, cognitive and embodied maps for otherwise futures. Black Geographies is not simply about mourning what has been lost, but about attending to the openings and the fissures and the new world beings made in real life. This is what Dr. Cesare Warren might explain to us as movement between mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, to mourning, M-O-R-N-I-N-G. To take up Black geographies in the study of education is to understand it as a project of exposure and invention. While it exposes the white spatial imaginary and other spatial logics of racial domination, to reveal how the shape of our schools and our neighborhoods is marked by an anti-Black design, it simultaneously invents by showing us what Black life has always known. And that is that space is never final, space is never closed, and space is never wholly determined. And that in the midst of enclosure, Black people have always carved out ruptures, spaces of beauty and resistance and possibility. So for those interested in the study of Black geographies, particularly in education, one of the things I think we must learn to do is see differently. I think we must learn to recognize the everyday geographic, that we must recognize that everyday geographies of oppression is met by counter geographic praxis of survivals, particularly employed and mobilized by Black bodies. That every line of exclusion is met with the practice of crossing, that even in the wake of slavery, Black life continues to make worlds not given by power, but dreamed into being by those very people who refuse to disappear. I want to turn for a minute, if you will, because I mentioned my background in literature, so I gotta bring it into this conversation. So I want to turn for a minute to Ralph Ellison's 1952 novel, The Invisible Man. In the book's prologue, Ellison discusses not just his invisibility, but the peculiar conditions that make his invisibility possible. In that text, he writes, "The invisibility to which I refer occurs because of a peculiar disposition of the eyes of those with whom I come in contact, a matter of the construction of the inner eye, those eyes with which they look through their physical eyes upon reality." I'll read that again. The invisibility to which I refer occurs because of a peculiar disposition of the eyes of those with whom I come in contact, a matter of the construction of the inner eye, those eyes with which they look through their physical eyes upon reality. In this quotation, in this text, Ellison reminds us that invisibility is not about the Black body being unseen, but it's about how Black life, and even in the context of this talk, Black spaces, are seen through an anti-Black gaze, distorted, diminished, and ultimately poised for erasure, through the racial logics embedded in the inner eye of the beholder. It is a disconsciousness produced not by accident, but by design. As Joyce King has argued, the racialized disconsciousness is pointed to deny Black people access to humanity. And when we connect this disconsciousness, this disconscious seeing to place, the inner eye denies Black people a Black sense of place, a claim to space, or a right to occupy space and belonging. I meditate on the notion of the inner eye, not simply as just a metaphor, but a seeing device that has material consequences up and against Black life. It is the same inner eye that enabled George Zimmerman to imagine Trayvon Martin's very existence as a threat and pursue and kill him. It's the same inner eye that allowed Derek Chauvin to press his knee into George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, unmoved by his pleas, blind to his breaths until his life was gone. It's the same inner eye that led police departments, especially the LAPD, to mark NHI, no humans involved, on reports of crime where the victims were Black, as if Black death were not a tragedy, but a non event, a normal occurrence, a rightful sentence, unworthy of recognition, care, or compassion. What Ellison named in 1952 as a peculiar disposition of the eyes continues to operate as a particular type of racial optic, a type of orientation that sees Blackness as criminal, expendable, disposable. Ellison's invisible man is not invisible in the literal sense. He is hypervisible to power, yet unseen in full relational, spatial, and social existence. Through this framework, I see the inner eye as an optic of anti-Blackness toward people and the spaces and places where Black people exist. When attending to Ellison's inner eye, I can trace how racialized vision shapes not just how bodies are legible, but how spatial knowledge is itself produced. It is in the intersection at the meeting point of perception, power, and place that Black Geographies intervenes because, again, Black Geographies insists on a rereading and an interrogation of how the inner eye produces landscapes of domination or grounds that are demonic. Drawing on Ellison's novel of The Inner Eye, Sylvia Wynter wrote a letter to her colleagues in the early 1990s, which she titled very much No Humans Involved. In that letter, Wynter takes up Ellison's metaphor of the inner eye and poses a profound question. She asks, if, as Ralph Ellison alerted us to in The Invisible Man, we see each other through the inner eyes with which we look our physical eyes upon reality, the question we must confront becomes, what is our responsibility for making those, for what is our responsibility for the making of those inner eyes? Winter is not only asking how eyes are calibrated to see people, she is asking us to consider how we see the very world we inhabit, the places that Black people imagine and create, the sociality of Blackness that produces new modes of thriving and being, and research methodologies and orientations that we are trained to leverage to make sense of this world. Our inner eyes are taught to see place, to see people through the logics of colonialism and capitalism and racial hierarchy, especially within the educational enterprise that insist on reproducing dominant ways of knowing. Now, I've had to sit with Sylvia Wynter's question around our responsibility for remaking the inner eye, because for me, that's not a training or that's not a process that is necessarily developed through traditional modes of schooling. I think to retrain and to reshape that invisible eye, that takes a different sort of labor, a different sort of service to the life and well-being of Black people. But Winter presses us further. The central issue that confronts us here, she writes in this letter, is whether we will be able to move beyond the epistemic limits of our present inner eyes in order to transform our present order of knowledge. In other words, she's asking us, can we learn to see space differently? Can we move beyond the inherited maps that confine Black life to zones of neglect or hypervisibility and instead perceive the ways Black communities have always reimagined and remade space? The particular seeing that Ellison and Winter reinforce is useful in considerations of what it might mean to take up Black geographies in education and hold seriously a Black sense of place in our scholarly endeavors. I want to meditate. I want to offer you all or share some of the thinking I've been doing in relation to this notion of the inner eye at the intersection of literature, Black studies, and Black geographies. I've been sort of playing or thinking with this idea of a Black optic. Um, I I I believe that to truly engage Black geographies and to take seriously the entanglement of race, place, and power in the study of education and schooling, that we must transform our sight. I think it requires what I am sort of thinking about is this notion of a Black optic. Now, I first encountered the idea of a Black optic when I was actually doing a collaboration with Dr. Okello and Dr. Niachai, as well as working on a separate project with Dr. Justin Coles and Cesare Warren. And we were, all of us across these two projects, we were thinking about Black humanity in different ways and trying to really understand the tensions, if such exist, around what we think about or what has been thought around Black humanity. And I've encountered Willis Wright's work, and it resonated with me so clearly. His thinking that he it resonated so clearly with me. His thinking on sort of this notion of seeing and optics. Specifically, while working on the review, I began to think about what it might mean to see Black humanity and Black spaces differently that are not produced through white dominant ways of seeing and knowing. Framing this idea of a Black optic as a way of seeing in the dark, grounded in Black consciousness, it reframed educational geographies to expose what has been rendered invisible, reorient what is assumed, and envision what is possible. I consider a Black optic as more than a lens, but an epistemological orientation that anchors how we see the world, how we interrogate space and place, and Black belonging. It's for me, it's rooted in a Black consciousness, and not Black consciousness in the thin sense of awareness, but in the thick sense that Lewis Gordon gives us in his newest book, Fear of Black Consciousness. In this text, Lewis Gordon argues that Black consciousness, with the capital B, is a political and collective orientation that refuses to locate the problem in Black people, and instead unmask the problem in the world that insists on casting Blackness as a problem. Black consciousness, in Gordon's rendering, is a practice of seeing otherwise. It is the recognition that the work of liberation begins with the shift in perception away from pathology imposed upon Black life and toward the liveliness, the aliveness, and the ongoingness of Black being. A Black optic, then, is the inheritor of this consciousness. A Black optic asked us to retrain our inner eye, to unlearn the spatial grammars that cast Black communities as placeless, as if Black neighborhoods are simply zones of decay, as if space itself were neutral, natural, and untouched by power. A Black optic asks us to perceive space as racialized, contested, and alive, to notice how Black life exceeds, remakes, and refuses the maps it has been given. As Dion Brand and Christina Sharp and other Black scholars remind us, to stand and to see is always relative to the door of no return, that site of rupture that continues to echo across time. A Black optic is then a type of endarkened knowledge, an unscientific method. And I know that this notion of unscientific method, talking to a bunch of scientists in education, might ruffle some feathers, but I think a Black optic requires a bit of an unscientific method as we have been trained to think about what it means to be scientific. And Sharp calls it a way of seeing space, not by official cartographies, but by the resonances of memory, loss, resistance, and possibility. To adopt a Black optic is to bury the inherited logics of white spatiality, those methods drilled into us through schools and disciplines, those habits of thoughts that make enclosure seem inevitable, that make dispossession seem rational. A black optic opens instead another geography. I think it opens a meditation on space and place that is not trapped in the grammar of suffering, but is capacious enough to register joy, imagination, and creation. It is the ability to see Black communities not simply as wounded spaces, but as laboratories of living otherwise. It is a way of holding sight that refuses foreclosure. I think a Black optic insists on the possibility of Black placemaking, even in the teeth of displacement, that insists upon the presence of Black life in spaces where the map once said nothing. And these are some of the questions that I have been thinking about as I'm doing my current research at the intersections of public housing and education, educational outcomes, really thinking about this notion, because in some ways I've sort of turned back to questions around gentrification, although that's not where I started. But thinking about Black belonging and Black living and displacement has taken me back or returned me to questions around where Black folk live and thrive and how policies disrupt that. And in doing that work, I have to adapt a Black optic, but that means I also have to choose to see geography differently. I have to let my inner eye be remade, not by the logics of dominance or by the textures of Black existence. I'm sorry, not by the logics of dominance, but by the textures of Black existence, the poetics of Black space, the geographies of survival, and the geographies of hope. My thinking around the Black optic is rooted or connected to other scholarship that has other scholarship in Black studies that has already considered notions of seeing um, within social scientific research. So I situate my understanding of a Black optic alongside Black studies scholarship that pushes to new modes of seeing and knowing. In this way, the Black optic emerges from a long and insistent lineage of Black thought. I trace sort of the contours of a Black optic to Du Bois's gift of second sight that he writes about in The Souls of Black Folk, the double consciousness that seeing is both through and against the eyes of the world. This idea of the Black optic is also rooted in um, Christina Sharp's insistence that we must learn to see in the wake, to apprehend how the afterlives of slavery shape the present. It touches on Robin D.G. Kelly's freedom dreams, and it also echoes in the work of Catherine McKittrick's declaration that Black matters are spatial matters. I should also add to this graphic that the Black optic surfaces what Cesare Warren might call night vision, a way of seeing sharpened in conditions of constraint, a clarity found in darkness. Taken together, I think a Black optic, or at least as I'm still sort of formulating the idea and trying to think with it, gathers insights from these teachings, refracts them, and turns them toward the geographies of Black, and turns them toward the Black geographies and Black education. A Black optic is what allows us to perceive space not as neutral, not as an empty terrain, but as an arena where Blackness belongs, where Blackness believes, and where Blackness becomes. Through the optics, through this optic, education itself comes into view differently. It reorients our gaze away from the maps and metrics of the state, away from the logics of testing and zoning and surveillance, and toward the everyday geographies of Black life. It allows us to see learning not simply within classroom or curriculum, but in the fugitive, resilient, and creative practices of placemaking, in the making of home against dispossession, in the dreaming that happens on stoops and playgrounds and kitchen tables. I think about a Black optic in these ways, and I've started to think about what it might take to structure a Black optic and point it directly toward the geographies where education unfold. Um, this is a new sort of frame of thinking that I've done in reflection to some of the previous work that I have already sort of published and written about, particularly work I've done, the intersections of Black in the Borderlands project that I worked on while I was a professor at the University of Arizona, living in borderland context, really trying to understand these new modes and these different orientations around Blackness in space that I was bearing witness to while living in Arizona, and having written and published about how race is understood and embodied within borderland context. I wanted to be able to reflect on what that could look like and the evolution of that thinking in relation to Black geographic thought. I'm taking a note of time here, and I want us to have questions for conversation because, again, this is sort of a newer idea that I am considering, and I want to get some feedback. So I'll end us with a few sort of enduring questions that I've started to think about in relation to Black optics and Black geographies, and what that means for the study of education. One in particular is, how might a Black optic illuminate the quiet, everyday acts of resistance and creation that constitute an otherwise geography of education. How do these acts transform our understanding of what education is and what education could be? Another idea that I'm thinking with and trying to sort of consider in the next phase of my thinking along these lines is what histories of erasure, rupture, and displacement shape the otherwise. Geographies where Black children and communities learn and thrive. So, really trying to get a sense of the spaces where Black learning actually happens. And this could be on the stoop that I referenced as I mentioned the movie Crooklyn, or this could be in these other spaces that we just have not yet sort of seen as necessarily sites of learning and education for Black people. Third question I'm thinking about is how do Black geographies invite us to imagine schooling, pedagogy, and community in the otherwise as spaces already inhabited by possibility, imagination, and life? And then last, what might learning look like in the otherwise spaces that Black communities already inhabit, claim, and remake? That is my time today. I leave you with these questions for further conversation and discussion, and hope that we can move to a space where we can articulate and dialogue around some of these ideas and what it means to take up a Black optic as we reorient our understanding around Black geographies and apply that thinking to educational scholarship. Thank you.
Dr. Jenkins, we're deeply moved. I'll just say that we're deeply moved and inspired. Just read in the chat. Thank you so much for your insight, for your clarity, for trusting us with your emerging thoughts on what you propose as a Black optic, how you're in conversation with this genealogy of scholars who are helping us to think Blackness as a potentiality for seeing and knowing differently. And so in all the ways that you all already are and can help me show love to Dr. Jenkins. You can clap, you can come off mute, you can do whatever you need to do. But thank you for that. I imagine some questions might be emerging in the chat, but do feel free to come off of mute and pose any questions we have with the last 9 minutes that we have. Questions for Dr. Jenkins? John, I see your hand.
Yes, hello, thank you so much. I have kind of a naive question. I really enjoyed the presentation. And with your conceptualization of Black optic, do you see, and they may be both, but pushing for greater equity and property as a form of place versus, or in conjunction with, trying to address the racist lens or ideology that leads to that oppression through place? Are they combined, or is there one sort of push versus another that you would suggest us to work on?
Can you clarify what you mean by your use of property in that question?
So the notion that, like, through colonization, it's largely been an attempt to acquire property from people of color, and then through systemic structures, keep property at a minimum for people of color. And I was just wondering if I was kind of connecting that to the notion of place, but I may be stretching it. So I was just curious if, as a solution, what you would suggest dealing with the structure of colonialism in place or property, or is it more of like the intellectual ideology of white America that you're hoping to address and change?
Yeah, I think one of thank you for that question, and thank you for clarifying the question as well. One of the things that I hope that I intend to sort of think with through the sort of notion or reckoning with the Black optic is that it reorients and retrains how we sort of see the world, right? And I think part of that is us being able to have these very critical conversations on this overall notion of property and ownership, because that itself is rooted in a colonial mindset that is less about community and more about power and control and right and for lack of a better word, property ownership. I think that there are modes of disruption that already exists around or that are starting to emerge more consistently that disrupt this notion of property. So and this I'm thinking about social housing, for example, right? Where homes and land and space is shared by communities, owned essentially by communities, as a way to foster community, foster collective action and organizing. So, I think just in terms of that notion, I'm like, I wonder how a Black optic, especially as you mobilized through an understanding of geography and space, might allow us to interrogate or become suspicious of this sort of notion of property in that way, right? And also how that optic may allow us to see and unsee things differently.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Reading a question from the chat, how might the Black optic be used to illuminate Black joy and refocus deficit-based narratives? That's from Louisa Holmes.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that is, as I'm thinking about it, I think that's one of the things that it is particularly poised to do, is to see the interactions and the refusal and the survival praxis of Black people, particularly as modes of joy that refocus away from that. So when Black kids are hanging out on the stoop, they are not loitering, they are not gathering, they are convening, that is a moment of pedagogy. That is a moment of community, right? And how do we sort of see those things as one of the spaces where Black life learns, right? And how do we sort of embrace that as one of those spaces of otherwise? And that's just not, and I use that example on the stoops. I keep going back to that imagery, but I think we can also see that in modes of class, within the context of schools. So I think about, man, I mean, I'm probably gonna date myself here a little bit, so don't judge me by my age. But I remember I remember being in school with with my people, and we over in the corner, and we cracking all your mama jokes. We are doing the dozens. We are doing that thing, right? And if you think about all the joy and disrespect, but all the joy and love and community that comes from that sort of exchange, I think my teachers during those moments would see that as something that needed to be disrupted, something that needed to be reprimanded against. Like, right? And I'm like, well, wait, I think there is learning and there's pedagogy and there's joy and there's all these other things that are happening within those moments that a Black optic allows us to see. Right. And I think if we are thinking about and interrogating those spaces differently, how do we retrain our eyes? And for those of us who train students, how do we help to retrain our students' eyes, especially those students who don't look like us, right? Who do not have sort of the Black embodied experience. How do we also train them to see those things differently? And I think that becomes a fundamental, I don't want to say first step, but a fundamental step in really reframing the educational geographies. This also makes me think around some of the work that Fred Moten and colleagues put together in the undercommons, right? What are the things that are happening in these under and otherwise spaces that might serve as resistance? Folks just don't understand it. And that's not to say that we necessarily need to make it legible for them, but how then do we train what we see and how we see and how we um and how we articulate that seeing in our scholarship.
Dr. Jenkins, we have a minute left. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask you one question, and I'm going to ask you to tell us where to find you so that the questions that have been placed in the chat can be directed toward you. But I hear you calling for, a la Sylvia Wynter, an epistemic break or epistemic departure from this sort of Western way of thinking being seeing, right? And one of the ways I believe that we can sort of move toward this epistemic rupture is by what we read, right? And so my question for you, what are you reading? What do you propose that folks in this meeting read as they develop a Black geographic orientation? And then where can we find you?
Yeah, good question. So I have been drawn recently to some speculative work.
Yeah, yeah.
So I just picked up Black Utopia.
Mm,
Um, Black Utopia. Oh, that's not the name of the book. That's not the.
follow.
But yeah, I literally just picked up Black Utopia. Black Utopias, and I had started reading that. Black Utopia's speculative life. I'm trying to get the full title because I always mess it up. Speculative Life and the Music of the Other Worlds. And I think that's what I had been sitting with as I was like writing the abstract and conceptualizing this talk. Because I've really been, I got to get out with all that's happening in the world. I'm looking for escape. Okay.
Right.
I
Yeah.
am really thinking about what are the texts, what are the ideas
Mhm,
that I can
mhm,
think about to position escape or to think about future and these
mhm,
other modes, right? So I, I
mhm,
I think there is some really generative thinking in the speculative
mhm,
space around
mhm.
Black studies. So if folk have not had a chance to an opportunity to engage in some of that text, I really encourage you to pick it up and make some room for it in your thinking. I think adding that to your suite of knowledge will only enhance your ability to dream.
That's right. That's right.
So that's what I want to point you. That's one text I picked up as I was thinking about this talk and thinking about these otherwise elsewhere spaces.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Where can folks find you?
You can find me in otherwise elsewhere. You can. I will. My email address is my first name, DeMarcus at upenn.edu. So that's a place that you can contact me directly. I think that's probably the best mode. I used to be much more active on Twitter or X, but given all the givens that's been gave, I have
Moved on.
sort of had to step back from that a little bit and
Yeah,
trying to use a Black optic to re-understand my relationship to those spaces, right? If I'm being transparent about that.
sure.
But I think email is probably the best way and the most immediate to connect.
Beautiful. Thank you for assisting us in thinking about the ways Black geographies can announce or animate a range of possibilities for how we know, for how we do, for how we be in the world. I'm grateful to you, my friend. Thank you all so much for joining us for this first iteration of the Black Geographies webinar series. We look forward to having you in November. We'll be hearing from Dr. Latoya Eves. Dr. Jenkins, we appreciate you. We'll be in touch. Gratitude, deep
Thank you.
gratitude. Thank you
You
all so much
all.
for joining us.
Thank you. Be well.